Okay, the last time we met, we were discussing the early origins of the English North American Empire. And I had made the case at the time that the English were very different than any other European group to colonize North America for a lot of different reasons. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to broaden the scope of that English North American Empire. Part of the way that we're going to broaden it is by discussing a group of colonists from England that we have come to call the Puritans. Many of you have some loose familiarity with the Puritans, but I want to make the case very, very clearly early on that what the Puritans essentially were religious exiles. That's worth writing down, that they were religious exiles, and part of the reason that they had been exiled in the first place was that they were deeply, deeply critical of the Anglican Church. We don't need to make this into a European history class, let alone a religious European history class, but I'll say this. During the reign of Henry VIII, we see England break away from the Catholic Church. And for a lot of political reasons, Henry VIII is going to establish the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and he's going to make himself the head of that church, as well as the head of the English state. To make a long story short, this group of religious exiles that we've come to call the Puritans had become quite critical of the Church of England. Accused it of becoming corrupt, accused it of becoming too deeply intertwined in politics, was very critical of the Church of England. And as you might imagine, beginning in the late 1500s, the early 1600s, this is going to get them into some pretty considerable trouble with the law in England. To make a long story short, what happens is they're forced out of that country. And originally they're going to take refuge across the English Channel in Holland. But eventually they're going to set sail for America, with the destination originally being Jamestown or Virginia. Now, they don't make their way over to Virginia. Instead, they land 500 miles to the north in what they would eventually name the Plymouth Colony. Many of you, going all the way back to grade school, may remember the story of the Puritans coming over on this ship that they called the Mayflower, the trials and tribulations. But I want you to keep something in mind for just a minute, and that is this concept of American political thought. I made mention of this the last time when we were talking about self-representative government in Jamestown or religious toleration in Maryland. That American political thought starts much, much earlier than we tend to think of it as American citizens. You see this in what would come to be known as New England as well. On board the Mayflower, when they were coming over, you have an official within the Puritan Church, a guy by the name of William Bradford, who is going to be instrumental in signing what comes to be known as the Mayflower Compact, or the Mayflower Contract, whichever you prefer. What the Mayflower Compact does is it basically establishes a set of playing rules that the Pilgrims and the Puritans would agree to abide by once they got to America. Sometimes this involved rules and expectations. Other times this involved who got what chunks of land and how much. But in any case, it spelled out who was in charge and the extent of their power. That ought to sound familiar to you. There's a lot of historians, myself included, that consider the Mayflower Compact to be the original American Constitution. Because if you think about the Constitution, what it really does at the end of the day is it spells out what branch of government is in charge of what power, whatever it is that you're talking about, and the extent, the limitations to that branch of government's power. And so, similar to Jamestown and Maryland and everybody that we talked about the last time we met, we see some pretty core principles of American democracy emerge in what will come to be known as the New England colonies. Similar to John Smith and the Jamestown colony, the interaction with indigenous peoples were very, very important for the Puritans once they made landfall in what they would come to call the Plymouth Colony. The predominant group of native people in the region was a group that called themselves the Wampanoag people. And you're looking at some representations of the Wampanoag people on that slide if you're following along with me. And as you can see, or I'm hopeful that you're able to see, they were organized at a village level. Now, the reason that I tell you this, and the reason this is important, is because the Puritans were coming from a very village society, or at least a village organized society back in England. And so there was some pretty important alliances and friendships that were established early on because the one side recognized the other, if you follow me. The Wampanoag people were the predominant group in the region, but they were not the only group. And many of you have maybe a vaguely familiar understanding of the story that I'm about to tell you. But very similar to John Smith and Jamestown, it would have been very unlikely that the Puritans would have survived those first initial New England winters had it not been for indigenous peoples, especially an individual that we call Squanto. Now, Squanto was a member, we think, of a group that used to call themselves the Massasoit. And this group, we believe, was ravaged by European diseases, especially things like smallpox. We talked about that when the Spanish made land contact in the Americas upon Columbus's arrival in the New World. Partly because he was alone in the world, most of his family was dead, and partly because he saw how helpless many of these English colonists were, Squanto befriended the Puritans that had made landfall in the region. And one of the things that he's very instrumental in instructing them would be how to cultivate a very important crop, corn. You need to understand how important this is because corn, as we've established in this class, is an American crop. It's not something that was seen or grown in Europe. And if you know anything about planting and cultivating corn, you know that it's very different than the crop that most Europeans would have been very familiar with, and that would have been wheat. It's Squanto that really teaches the English how to successfully cultivate crop, and it's Squanto that really is instrumental in getting them over the hump, especially in those first few winters. What you're going to see is a pretty solid friendship that will be established between the Puritans and the Wampanoag people and other local groups within the region that we call New England, the New England colonies, 500 miles to the north of Virginia and Maryland. And this alliance, if you will, is going to be solidified in the fall of 1621. And this story might sound kind of familiar to you. A truce was hammered out in that fall between the Puritans and the Native Americans. They got together to seal the deal here. They ate a lot of food. They complained about their enemies, and they had conversations with people that made them uncomfortable. And of course, I'm talking about Thanksgiving, or the tradition that we have come to call Thanksgiving. This is going to be this idea of a lasting friendship. This is going to be an important development because similar to the befriending of Powhatan to John Smith, it's going to be instrumental for the English survival within the region. Now, the first colony that the Puritans are going to establish would be in 1620 in what they'll call Plymouth. And again, if you're following along with me on the video, you're looking at a traditional early New England colony, including Plymouth Rock. If you look at the middle of the screen there, you'll look closely, you'll see that the year 1620 is etched into that big rock, Plymouth Rock. But as you also might be able to gather, Plymouth was established not so much different than Jamestown, really as sort of a military fortification, and it would grow outward and upward thereafter. There's another individual that I need you to be mindful of, and he's going to come a little bit later, a few years later, a guy by the name of John Winthrop, who was an official within the Puritan Church. Winthrop is going to lead another expedition of Puritans, and they're going to establish another New England colony that will come to be known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You call this Boston, or the current day city of Boston. And you have to understand the perspective that John Winthrop was coming at this endeavor with. As an official within the Puritan Church, he really felt that the Puritans that were going to comprise the Massachusetts Bay Colony were having the world watch them, that they were on this great big stage, and the survival of the Puritan faith was really at stake here. This was really God's work as far as he was concerned. Purification of the Anglican Church depended and thus hung in the balance. One individual that John Winthrop waited upon with a lot of expectation, a lot of hope, really, was another official within the Puritan Church, a guy by the name of Roger Williams. And Roger Williams was another one of these officials, and Winthrop really saw him as key to taking the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the next level. One of the things that he did not anticipate was that Winthrop would be very put off by the world in which John Winthrop had been responsible for creating. Winthrop had created a society at Massachusetts Bay where religion was deeply intertwined with politics, and politics was deeply intertwined with religion. In a lot of instances, if you weren't an official within the Puritan Church, you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office, you couldn't testify on courts, in some cases you couldn't even own property. And when Williams got to Massachusetts Bay, he was not real enthusiastic about the world that he was witnessing. He was actually very critical of it. And the reason being is that Williams felt that politics just had a natural corrupting aspect on the institution of religion, and if you didn't separate the two, inevitably politics would corrupt religion. And he brings this revelation to his friend John Winthrop, who really can't believe what he's hearing. It's one of those situations where I never expected to hear that from your mouth, and they're appalled. It's not just Winthrop. There's other people that are leaders, power brokers within the Massachusetts Bay Colony that are furious at Roger Williams, so they banish him. As a matter of fact, they banish him. They exile him 50 miles to the south, and Williams is going to be important in the foundation of a new colony, Rhode Island. Now, one of the first things that they'll do in Rhode Island is they'll establish this notion of a separation of church and state. In other words, although most Rhode Islanders saw themselves, and in fact were, Puritans, similar to the John Winthrop variety, they were not going to officially force that religion on the people that were colonists in that region. Again, if you're thinking about this in the context of chronicling American political thought, this is a really important development because it's going to lead to the concept of separation of church and state. But there's still one more person that I want to mention when it comes to, somebody that's going to add another nuance, another wrinkle, if you will, to life in the New England colonies, and that's a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a deeply devout Puritan, deep religious convictions, and generally speaking, what she begins doing is conducting what I can probably best describe as Bible study. That's really what she's doing. She's conducting these meetings in the aftermath of the Sunday sermon, and they discuss scripture, they discuss the sermon, they discuss its connections to their regular everyday lives. The problem with that is Anne Hutchinson is inviting both men and women to these gatherings. Now, you and I don't think anything of that, but the Puritan world was a deeply traditional Western European world, and it was a world in which women were not supposed to be speaking in public in front of men. Women were supposed to be auxiliaries, helpers. They were supposed to be seen, but probably not heard from. And so John Winthrop called Anne Hutchinson out on this and said, "You need to stop doing what you're doing." And Anne Hutchinson, much to his surprise, threw it right back in his face. She says something, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but she says something to the effect of, "If God calls them to meet with me, then who am I to tell them that I can't speak to them? If God calls upon me to speak to them, then who am I to refuse the word of God?" Right? In other words, what Anne Hutchinson begins developing is this concept of all souls are equal. That might sound a little bit familiar to you, especially in the context of an American history class, but all souls equal. In other words, you don't have to be born into a position of power, authority, wealth, prestige, social standing, or anything like that. God, in her mind anyway, created all souls equal, and all souls ought to have the opportunity to interpret biblical scripture or to do God's work on an equal opportunity basis. Now, of course, what I'm driving at is the concept of all men created equal. And this is going to be a very fluid and a very evolving sort of context, or excuse me, concept throughout the course of American history. But Anne Hutchinson is a very important part, because this is going to become deeply ingrained into the American psyche, that this concept of equality. It's religious equality, but all the same, it's going to have a political application over the course of American history. Many of you might have some familiarity with what I'm about to talk about, and because the Puritans were so deeply convicted of their religious beliefs, they believed that God could possess a person. I mean, Anne Hutchinson probably believed this. And God could use that person as a vehicle to do his work. But keep in mind, if God can do this, then so can Satan, right? Anyway, what the Puritans called a person possessed by Satan would be a witch. And anything that struck them as out of the ordinary, something that was a little bit off, just odd, not quite right, in their minds, that could potentially mean some sort of satanic involvement, and they could very well be a witch. Nowhere do you see this become more public than in Salem, Massachusetts, a port town, an import-export town just outside of Boston. In a process that's going to come to be known as the Salem witch trials, what you're going to see is many high-ranking Puritans within the church using the threat of calling somebody a witch to really control the society that some people are feeling they're beginning to lose control of. What I want you to understand about witchcraft, and as they relate to the Salem witch trials of 1692, is that it's a very effective form of social control. You have to understand that being accused of being a witch was a really difficult thing to prove that you just simply weren't. I'll give you a good example as what I'm talking about here in a minute. But in any case, the onus was on the alleged witch to prove his, or usually her, innocence. And that was not something that was very easy to do. And so if you began questioning policies, ideas, concepts within the Puritan church, maybe that was a little bit odd. Maybe it was so odd that eventually they just came to understand you to be a witch. And so rather than to question these policies, whether to be the guys or the lady standing on the outside looking in, a lot of people went with the flow. I'm hopeful that you can understand that the accusation of witchcraft was a good way, and I mean this in a bad way, but it was a very effective way to get people to fall in line and get them to do what you wanted them to do. Um, Good example as to what I'm talking about would be the case involving Rebecca Nurse, which is something just right outside. It's an incident that takes place just outside of Salem. Rebecca Nurse was this little old lady who was approximately 70 years old in 1692, the height of what's called the Salem witch trials. But she gets into a legal tiff, with her neighbors, the Putnams. And to make a long story short, Rebecca Nurse actually won that legal case. She had the judge side with her, but the Putnams were not people that really took too kindly to defeat. And so the Putnam women, these neighbors, just right along her property, accused her, this little 70-year-old lady, of being a witch, and they put her on trial. And so the jury of her peers heard evidence and weighed and evaluated that evidence. And when they came back with the verdict, they found Rebecca Nurse to be not guilty. Upon hearing this, once again, the Putnams were furious, and they began throwing themselves on the ground and grabbing their throats and, tearing at their eyes and acting as if someone or something had a hold of them. And of course, what they were driving at was the idea that it was Rebecca Nurse, and she was summoning these demons and these spirits to torture and torment them. And the jury, seeing all of this unfold, says, maybe we got this one wrong. And they go back into deliberation, and shortly thereafter, they produce a guilty verdict. And shortly thereafter, they executed Rebecca Nurse at the gallows. They hang her. The tragic reality is that the case involving Rebecca Nurse was very reflective of the 1692 Salem witch trials. Most of the victims are going to be women. There are a few men. There are 2 dogs. I'm not entirely sure what the dogs would have been up to get themselves into this kind of trouble, but in any case, it's a very similar sort of experience for these 16 unfortunate souls that are ultimately going to be convicted of witchcraft and executed in similar fashions. But I mean, I think about this. If you're watching all of this happen, and maybe you have a question or something that you're not exactly real enthusiastic about when it comes to the Puritan Church, you might want to hold that question unless you want to suffer a similar fate. So I'm hopeful that you can see the accusation of witchcraft in the Salem witch trials in particular was a very effective way for the Puritan Church to hold on to its position in colonial New England. All this being said, seriously, I'd much rather live in New England as opposed to Virginia or Maryland. The reason why is very simple. The Puritans interpreted work and a very tough work ethic as pleasing to God. You've heard the expression, the idle hands are the devil's workshop. In other words, the busier you are, the less likely you are to commit sin. And if you think about it, there's really no job more difficult, more time-consuming, and just back-breaking than being a farmer. And so farm work is going to become a really important endeavor in New England. But again, think very logically about this. What you need to be a farmer is land and access to land. Now, of course, people in Virginia needed land as well, but the dynamic there is very different than it is in New England, primarily because New England is settled with people that are really, really committed to this idea of living the holy life. And so one reason that I feel like I would rather live in New England as opposed to the tobacco colonies was that in order to please God, they made everybody into farmers. And in order to make everybody into farmers, they doled out land on a much more equal basis. Keep in mind, you had to be able to get over to Virginia to claim your 50 acres of land. That was not necessarily the case with the Puritans. They've got a very different model there. And so what you're beginning to see emerge is what historians refer to as a YEOMEN society. This is a society of farmers, but keep in mind, unlike those tobacco farmers in Virginia, they're not producing for urban markets. They're producing for local consumptions, either their family or the townspeople. It's a very different business model. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everybody got the same amount of land, that it was equally distributed. And I'm definitely not going to say that everybody got the same quality of land. I mean, just like in the 21st century, money talked back then as well. What I will say is most got some. And so with this land ownership came other political advantages, the ability to have some say in your day-to-day governance. Land ownership had its benefits. It came with the benefit, the political advantage of being able to have access to the court system. And so there's all of these, advantages that come along with having a YEOMEN society, and then I'm hopeful that that explains how and why I'd rather live in New England in the 1630s or 40s as opposed to Virginia or even Maryland. So to sum up and conclude, the colonization of New England was vastly different than that of Virginia and the tobacco colonies. Part of the reason is these are individuals that are religious exiles, and as such, they have a very different worldview once they get to the New World. The economy is very different, and part of this is connected to the way that the Puritans saw the world and their mission within that. But what I really want you to understand here as we conclude is that these two colonial societies are going to grow up largely independent of each other. And as such, they're going to have maybe not very, but certainly different experiences, and they're going to evolve differently. Now, the next time we meet, we're going to talk about yet another collection of colonists in the New World that will add yet still more diversity to our entire situation. So we'll pick it up there.